What's going on, everybody? It's Sean, joined again by my son, Trey. And today on Reactions to the Classics, a lot of people have been asking for it, Trey. It's going to be our reaction to the Get Back documentary by Peter Jackson. It's going to be the 25 things that we like the most, or our 25 biggest takeaways.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this, Dad. It seems we've had a couple big Beatles media things come out in the past few years, but nothing bigger than this, man. The great Peter Jackson of Lord of the Rings fame, of course. You know, probably no one better at the helm to get a lot of. He had 60 hours worth of footage on here, narrowing that down to 8.
Exactly.
It really did impress me, man, and a lot of stuff and a lot of nuggets to kind of go over here. So we're going to be bringing it at you in no particular order. Of course,
no particular order. This is not a countdown.
No, this is just our 25 of our favorite things from the documentary, man.
So first off, Trey, before we even get into the first thing, just I know a lot of people talk about the length of this. Originally it was supposed to come out in theaters, pushed back 3 different times. It's going to be 2.5 hours in theaters, and then they hit us with this. It's going to be on Disney Plus. It's going to be almost 8 hours long. I've seen a lot of people talk about, man, it's way too long. Now, I get that. For me, when there was about an hour left, I started getting sad.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you, man.
Because I don't think it's too long, but I understand. But I also think that if you're just a casual Beatles fan, you're going to be like, man, I don't get, like, you and I have a lot of inside knowledge. Like, if this is your first time joining us, we have over 60 Beatles vids up. We've done the entire discography, we've done solo stuff, we've ranked every song, we've done ranked every song of every album, we've done so much stuff. So we knew all about this. I knew so much about this, and boy, or I thought I did. I thought I knew so much about this, but I really didn't, because there was a lot of revelation in here, and that's kind of what these 25 things are really going to be about.
Oh, definitely, and I think you said it perfect, Dad. This isn't, if you don't know anything about the Beatles, this wouldn't be a good starting off point, in my opinion. If you're already really familiar with the Let It Be record, and are very familiar with the songs, I think you're going to just love it, man. And I think once you reach a certain point in any type of medium, like once you pass, the 4-hour mark or 5-hour mark, it's like, all right, we're in it for the long haul here. I think this was for
the casuals are already way gone, so we might as well just go.
So what's 8 hours if I'm already locked down for 5 or 6?
Yeah, and I know Peter said it. He said that if I wondered whether I should keep it or not, I just kept it, which is the opposite. If it would have been in the theater, then you cut it because you're trying to get Wink down. But he said, it'd be another 50 years before anybody sees it if I don't bring it. So err on the side of too much instead of too little, and especially on the format where we're watching in our own homes, where you can just consume it in whatever pieces you want. So I guess, Trey, that's going to kick us off. Like Trey said, no particular order whatsoever. But the first thing, Twickenham, I was shocked by the fact that we just went in here and we had no plan whatsoever.
No, it was, and I mean, it's just a humongous studio. The lads brought up a lot of different times how the acoustics weren't great.
It's a soundstage, man. It's a soundstage for movies and TV.
So I found that really interesting. You had a couple of George's Indian friends in there as well. And I just thought that it was unique in the fact, I did love the colorscape. I thought the colors in the background were really awesome. But just the whole concept of, all right, we're going to go at Twickenham and just, like you said, be on the sound stage and just hope that we can knock out, 13, 14 tracks.
Yeah, it was just crazy. We just come in, we don't really know. And then we don't know, we want to perform it live. That's the concept. We don't know where, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But the second thing on that goes right along with the crazy timetable, because Ringo was filming a movie with Peter Sellers. No worry, we'll get to Peter in a few minutes here. The Magic Christian. So they had to get this done by the end of the month. They had 3 weeks to come up with all these songs because of Ringo's movie, a movie that didn't get critical. It's a movie. They're the biggest artists in the world, and they're catering this movie. But it shows you how much they valued Ringo, because it was like, here's what we're doing. But that was crazy.
No, and I think that it brings up a good point too. I liked how in the documentary, like our base was kind of the calendar, and it would tell us this is day 1, 2, and it had the
because it kept you grounded.
Yeah, and in this first episode, I think it was the 18th of January, if I'm not mistaken, whatever that weekend was, where it was supposed to be the dress rehearsal for it was obviously going to be a TV show. That was our first, the first idea that really was sparking for everybody, and of course that changed as time went on, of course, which we'll get to here later on. But no, just being, I guess they say, Dad, some people work better under pressure.
And Paul actually mentions this later on. that they did work better under pressure. But on that note, since we're on that, let's talk about number 3, Michael Lindsey-Hogg. Now there's a lot to talk about with Michael, but first off, I'm going to say, yo, Michael, you went in there and maybe you had no choice. I know this guy's considered by many as the father of the music video. Seems like a nice guy. And by the way, still alive. I read an interview. I did a lot of research. This got me fascinated going down this Beatles rabbit trail once again, like the old days. But, you know, Michael should have had some sort of plan. He just comes in there and is like, where are we going to do this at?
No, I thought that was interesting. I've read online, you know, some people not high on old Michael here. I thought it was really fascinating how they thought about going to Libya, go to Africa in an outside like amphitheater by the sea.
And they were going to ship their fans. I mean, it's like,
how wild would that have been?
I guess if you just have so much money, you're
That's
just
true.
like, we'll just do this, man, and we'll just ship fans in there. I'm just like, what?
Well, and then they discussed too, you know, because all this is stemming from, you know, we want to have a live performance as well. They thought, well, maybe we could go to a hospital, not for real sick kids. You know,
that's what Michael said. Yeah,
they can't be too sick. But it just the being a fly on the wall as we were seeing all the different ideas that were being thrown around. It just really got your mind wondering, like, oh, what if they would have ended up going to Africa? That would have been legendary, I think. But
well, and then, you know, this Michael is in many scenes, and I know I've seen a lot of people barbecuing for this, but I actually like him. I think he's entertaining. He's sitting there chewing on that cigar all the time, and he interjects himself into things that you wouldn't think like the normal dude would. These are the 4 biggest guys around, but he's just popping in, and he's got his whole interesting side story. We won't go into it here because this is going to be the first episode of season 2 of the Reactions to the Classics podcast. So I'm not going to go into it here because I'm going to talk about all these other guys later on in future podcast episodes, just on them in general. But he may be the illegitimate son and the only son
that's right.
of Orson Welles. So there's a lot of story there. But I won't get into that. But I just thought Michael's an integral part of this because if it wasn't for Michael, we wouldn't have all this footage.
No, exactly. You know, that's a good point.
A lot of people hate the movie, the original movie, and neither you or I have never seen it. And there's no reason to at this point. But we also got to remember, if it wasn't for Michael and some of the stuff he did, and we'll talk about some of the stuff he did that may or may not be ethical in a few minutes, but we did have to do that. And number 4, Trey, which this would be number 1 for me, maybe, if I was ranking him, maybe it'd be number 1. And I know it's what everybody's talking about, but I hadn't seen any buzz on this. I didn't watch this till a couple weeks after it came out. I had to be in the right frame of mind. I know you didn't either. I had to be ready to really consume this in a quick manner. The Get Back. Paul pulling Get Back out of the air.
Out of thin air,
is
baby.
Really one of the craziest things I've ever seen in my 50 years on this earth. Like, and no one else is paying any attention to it. So this tells you a couple things. And we'll talk about Paul more in depth later, but I mean, this guy is an absolute musical genius. Say what you want about him. Like, he's just, it's insane. But the way he did that, and no one else was paying any attention.
No.
Like the other guys over there bored, doing other stuff. So this tells me this guy did this a lot. But to pull that out is just crazy.
No, and he's just strumming on the guitar, and then he just kind of starts vocalizing it as we get the melody to get back. You know, the way it's edited, it's only like a couple minutes. It's really remarkable, and I think you used the word genius. You know, Paul really shines through as the main man, the guy that really had the spark still, I think, in the group and the band.
Oh yeah, he gets a lot of heat for being domineering, but when you watch this, you see why he had to be.
He definitely comes across as bossy at times, and we'll get to that. But there had to be, I think, somebody at the
had
helm
to get this thing going
to really get that going. And that kind of leads into number 5 here. I have Paul being the maestro for "Don't Let Me Down" at Twickenham, where in him and John and George kind of bouncing ideas around for it. And there's just various points where Paul will be like, let's try this or do this. I just thought it was really interesting how throughout the 3 episodes we saw, I don't even know how many takes of both Get Back and Don't Let Me Down.
These were in my head for like 3 days after it's all right.
But the way that we were able to literally see how these songs progress from nothing to their final form was one of the big treats, I think, of this documentary.
I agree. My number 6, or our number 6 in here, is just Kevin. That's all. Just Kevin. I don't have much else to say about it, but Kevin's the guy in the doc, the kid, who just... Everybody needs a Kevin. It'd be nice to have a Kevin. Hey, man, I need that. Bringing the marmalade and toast, bringing him the coffee, bringing him the various alcohol stuff. Kevin, just boom, get it. I need it. Let's go. Mal Evans is a greater version of Kevin, and we'll get to him later on. But just Kevin, Trey, and then you got a little something to say about George at number 7.
Yeah, man, George Harrison in general. I think one of the coolest things was when they were still at Twickenham, and he comes back. He says, "Hey, did you see what was on TV last night?" And he talked about he saw some TV like ball inspiration that eventually inspired him to come back with "I Me Mine." He came back, and we noticed that a couple different times, Dad, where George in particular would come back and be like, "Hey, I think I kind of worked out this song, or maybe this part of a track, maybe this would work out a little bit better." And I just thought it was really interesting how we got inspiration just from just sitting back watching TV. Me and George, maybe we're not as different as I think here.
Yeah, there you go. That's exactly right. And while we're on George, okay, so there's a few things about George. Look, we both love George. I'm not going to speak for you. I think All Things Must Pass is the best solo album
from the Beatles.
Of the Beatles. You know, I think George is great, but I've always kind of bristled with this, and I'm just going to come out and say here, people who say at the end of the Beatles that George was on the same level as John and Paul, he just wasn't. And that's nothing against him. John and Paul are iconic, some of the greatest musicians and most talented musicians ever. You can maybe say at the end here, and we'll get into John later, he's on the same level as John, just because John's so checked out. But he's not on the same level, and this causes some issues, and he's getting into it with Paul. And I get it, man. I mean, they're not getting into it, but
there's some tension.
There's some tension.
Brewing over. I
think frustration.
From that kind of domineering, bossy attitude from Paul, where he's telling George, "Play it like this or this," and then George sarcastically almost is like, "Oh yeah, you just tell me how you want to play it."
And since they've last been together, George has hung out with Dylan and the band and been around and kind of probably respected in a much higher claim because, oh man, this Beatle is here with us. But now he goes back there and he says, George.
Well, and I found it interesting too. There was a point in the documentary where he notes that he felt the White Album was the first time he really contributed in a great way to any record. So I thought that was a bit enlightening as well. So you have all that, Dad, kind of brewing up in there, and obviously it leads to the culmination at the end of episode 1 where George quits the band. You just see him at the clubs.
Which there's all kinds of things out there about him and Winnie actually got into a fight and this and that. Now we even talked about it on the album review for this album, and that never happened.
No, and they even show in this documentary a little bit further on in some newspaper clippings where they read that, they got into a fight and they just...
And John even jumps up and does this exaggerated, throwing hooks in the air. That was hilarious. So he's gone. And here's where it's like, I don't know what I think about... I'm glad he did it. But about Michael Lindsey-Hogg, he had a microphone hidden in the flower pot in one of the rooms. And we get to hear the conversation of John and Paul about George leaving, and I'm like, I don't know, but I'm glad he did it, yet I'm not sure it's the most ethical thing to do.
That's one of my favorite parts of the entire documentary. It just came in shortly as episode 2 was underway, and you really get, I don't think of any other combo that's out there where you just get John and Paul talking about the state of the band, about their thoughts on George, and it was quite enlightening and a real great nugget that I think was in this documentary. And then they go and they meet with George a couple different times, try to get him back to bury it. The first meeting didn't obviously get the desired effect, and second meeting comes and there's a bit of rumors on that.
Yeah, we don't see it in the doc because there's not audio of when they go and meet, but I think it was Derek Taylor, don't hold me to that, as one in the inner circle, who was there and said that one of the big contentions in the second one was George had an issue with Yoko and didn't want her there anymore. Now, who knows if that's true or not, but there also is a rumor the reason why John didn't do the concert for Bangladesh is because George couldn't stand Yoko and didn't want her there for the 15 minutes that John would have performed. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's interesting that after they break up, just a year later, that they're all galvanized against Paul.
Yep.
Yet, in this case, it seems like George might have had the problem with Yoko. Maybe there's a little bit of that comes in. But then there's a funny moment after this meeting, but it puts that in context, because when you watch it on the screen, it's like it's an interesting thing for Paul to just start talking about Yoko. But if it is true they were talking about Yoko in this second meeting with George, it makes sense because he's sitting around, I think, with just Ringo.
Yes, yeah, he comes back. It's because I believe that George quit on that Friday.
Yes.
And then the Monday, and then John isn't there yet. He's running late. They try to get him, telegram him.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's just Ringo and Paul sitting around. And it was kind of a bit prophetic because Paul notes, he's all like, yeah,
it's crazy.
50 years from now, they'll be saying that the band broke up because Yoko sat on an amp. And, obviously today, for those who aren't as, deep into the Beatles, what do you hear? Oh, Yoko's the main reason the Beatles broke up, which is a total falsehood. But it was kind of funny how Paul was a bit prophetic in that.
Yeah, and I kind of, I've always bought into that being, I mean, that's what you hear. It's out there everywhere, but I don't believe that to be true anymore.
No, not at all.
At all. And I mean, I guess that kind of pops us in. We'll just talk about Yoko. I mean, I think many of us owe Yoko an apology.
Oh, yeah, but I thought she came across really good on. I mean, honestly, she's just kind of vibing, sitting there.
She's just vibing. I thought
next to John the entire time.
And there's some other accounts how, if you get into digging into John, that he was really a mess before Yoko came on. He's married to Cindy, but he's a mess. He's depressed. He's got these issues. And she kind of kept him going.
Oh, yeah. And so I thought she came across great. There's a moment in there where her and Linda are talking while they're going. There's a couple moments where I think it's the end of episode 1 where George leaves. It's Paul and John, Yoko, and Ringo having just some wild, almost punkish jam session, which was pretty cool. And, man, I think that this really dispels some of, those myths that we were talking about, that Yoko, she's the main reason that, I think you can't point to just one singular thing that is the reason that the lads broke up. It's a conglomeration.
Yeah, we'll get into another one of those from Mr. Alan Klein in a little while. On that, I mean, just talking about that and then the jam session. And John was just hilarious in a lot of different parts on here.
Yeah, I thought he came across great, man.
He's really hilarious when they met Peter Sellers on day 9. And part of that, Sellers is there because him and Ringo are making this movie.
That's right, the Magic Christian together. And, Sellers almost came across like he was, I don't know, nervous is the right word, but he, you see Peter Sellers, you think, oh, this guy's going to be hilarious.
Yeah, but I mean, walking in probably going like, what are all these cameras? I think he probably didn't understand what he was walking into. He's being filmed. He's like, I don't know what I want to say here.
But, man, John came across great. Very, a very smart alecky at a lot of different times.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Paul's being serious at different times, and John's mocking him while he's singing. So I could see how that would get irritating after a little while.
Even from the first day where he's like, everybody had a heart on, just in the midst of practicing these tunes to like do funny voices or do different types of things.
He was, and he was heavily into drugs at the time. Whether he's doing heroin yet or not, he definitely was after this. But I don't know whether him and Yoko were here or not. You see conflicting reports, but there's times where he seemed a little out of it. He never seemed like he was out of it on H. Not that I've been around people on heroin, but it's a different level. But so we talk about Yoko. Let's talk about Ringo next because Ringo is just the guy that I think everybody needs in their life, in that group dynamic or friend dynamic. Ringo's just always there, man.
Dude, every scene Ringo appeared on was great. He
really
was.
He's just there and he's ready to go. Whatever you need from me, I'm here. Now, of course, he had his own issues of quitting the band earlier on before this. But, I mean, he's just there. He's got a smile on his face, and he's ready to do whatever. And I never really thought about it until I was watching him when they rehearsed and stuff. And it's like, this guy had the bird's eye view of everything.
Oh, yeah.
He's behind it. He's removed from it as that drummer. You're back there, and you're just seeing it all play out.
Doing the 80th take of Get Back.
Yeah. And, his drumming is fantastic. And, it should dispel the myth of, he was just an average drummer. Because his drumming is fantastic. And you get to see how he just picks stuff up in a millisecond.
No, and I enjoyed his honesty too. There was a point in episode 1 where they're talking to him, and the subject of India gets brought up, and they're like, "Oh, did you like going to India?" And he was like, "Not really."
No, not really. He notoriously had a bad stomach and didn't like that about it, and and they end up reminiscing about their trip to India, which is pretty interesting because it's a big story of the White Album that we talk about. That's a 2-part review we did. That thing was so big. And we talked a lot about the India. So it was interesting seeing them talk about it just a year removed from it.
No, definitely, man. I believe they were in Apple Studios whenever they started really thinking back about it. I think, I don't even know. Somebody had like home footage of it. And I believe it was Paul talking about how it was really cool how they like introed everybody on there. And just kind of the going through and thinking that they were almost like back in school with how structured it was and whatnot. So
exactly.
It was those little moments. Another one of my favorite moments that's kind of in line with that is they also brought brought up the effect that Brian Epstein's death had on them, and started talking about the reasons that they were pushing through with this project, and just to really get that insight from them on how close Epstein, of course, was to them, and saw them through it all from the very beginnings. Having your manager pass, man, getting their insight was a great moment in this.
Yeah, and Epstein handled everything.
Yeah,
and I'll get into that on a future podcast, but he handled everything. So these guys, just, which they had enough on their plates, but now all of a sudden they're thrown in there like, we're here alone. It's like having an older brother, because he's not that much. He dies when he's 32, but I mean, he's 10 years older than him, roughly. So it's like having that older brother, and he's quarterbacking everything, and now he's gone.
No,
and so they're kind of, and that's kind of why Paul had to step up. John really wasn't in condition to, so somebody had to step up and do it.
No, man, I think that's a fantastic point. And now I guess we can switch gears to kind of just Apple Studio in general. I think we're up to number 14 or something on our...
Somewhere in here, you'll see it down below if you're watching on the YouTube video. So Apple Studio, here's what shocked me. So they decide when they're getting out of Twickenham that they're going to go to Apple Studio. So I'm just thinking, Apple Studio is going to be decked out as the Beatles.
Baller, yeah.
There's freaking nothing there. I'm like, why didn't they just go to Abbey Road? But I mean, they couldn't go there and record because they had to bring all this equipment over from Abbey Road and get it all set up. There was nothing there. I'm just like, okay.
Well, it didn't make me feel as bad as we were, doing a podcast and a video now at the time. We got so many different wires here and that. It's like, well, even the Beatles had trouble with their audio equipment and feedback and everything.
And the boys had no idea how to do anything.
No.
They had no idea how to do anything.
No, I just thought that was really interesting. I did much enjoy the vibe of Apple Studio.
I did too.
I would think as a musician you would as well. Obviously much smaller than just the soundstage at Twickenham. Probably much more conductive to
that green carpet,
creative work. And hey man, shout out. I love how they brought the anvil over because they practiced Maxwell Silverhammer at Twickenham. And hey, they still brought it over here to Apple Studio, and it was just vibing in the room the whole time.
And that's going to bring us up to the next thing then, Mr. Mal Evans.
Ooh.
Because McCartney mentions it'd be nice to have an anvil, and an hour later the anvil's there. Mal Evans, great story. Once again, I'll do a separate pod on Mal. I mean, it's a tragic story, really, of what happens to him after this in 1976. But that's a story for another day. But Mal worked his way up, through the Beatles, doing all kinds of stuff. He's been with them since '63, and he's the right-hand man. He's the one on the plane coming back with McCartney with the salt and pepper when they're coming back.
That's right.
They say, what is this? And McCartney has the brainstorm of Sgt. Pepper. I mean, this guy was around everything. But in here, he's like Kevin, who I mentioned earlier, on steroids. Not just because Mal was 6'6", but because that dude got everything. I need this, and Mal gets it done. Even when George quits, Mal goes over there and goes, hey, man, look, I'll figure out how to get you paid in royalties, and we'll make sure that you're taken care of. Like, this guy... I mean, he looked out for everything.
Oh, I don't have much more to add. I think you said it great. I thought he came across fantastic, man. Just a unit, like you said, 6'6" out there. And, man, it is a real shame that, his life kind of turned out as it did, and he didn't get a, bigger piece of the pie, so to speak, since he had been there from the beginning.
It's something I told you. I'll go ahead and share it here. That he's making 38 pounds a week when he started with them in 1963, and when he ended with them in 1970, he's making 38 pounds a week. Makes no sense to me. But before we get on, we're going to talk a little bit about another guy that I love. And now, your host for the evening, the Rolling Stones.
Oh, that was just a great gag that was in there.
It's just an ongoing.
Because John delivers that line in such a hilarious way because they wanted it's a play off the rock and roll circus,
which Michael Lindsey-Hogg did.
Yes,
he needed somebody to introduce it, and so he asked John if he would do it. And so
just that smart alecky John. He would call the Beatles the Bottles at numerous points as well. Just trying to keep that lighthearted nature, I guess, up and going, and it came across really well on screen too.
Definitely.
Number 17 on our list here, a little 1-2 punch: Glyn Johns and George Martin. Glyn Johns' fashion sense was just through the roof. I mean, everybody's was, man.
But he was a step above. So, and basically, George Martin, we'll just talk about him first because really he's hardly in it.
No, he's just kind of almost like the maestro, the fatherly figure that's just hovering above, making sure.
And he might have done a lot of stuff. He might not have wanted to be. George is a pretty distinguished guy. He might not have wanted to be on film, But like for the most part, Glenn Johns is running this thing.
Oh yeah,
and I mean,
in that production booth at Apple Studios, and him and the lads have a lot of good interactions as well.
And he's figuring out a bunch of stuff. He's just figuring out everything. He's quite the accomplished guy. He'll be another one I'll talk about on another podcast. But he, a lot of work with the Stones and did Led Zeppelin. I mean, just all kinds. But I mean, this guy knew his stuff.
Well, and it was interesting too. I thought that they had a deadline with him because he had to go to the States to help some group. I don't know what group it was.
They never said, and I couldn't find it. And I've listened to a couple of people talking about it. They don't know who it was either. But yeah, it's like I got to hurry up and get done because I got a commitment in Los Angeles. I'm like, dude, this is the freaking Beatles, man. But I mean, I get it. I respect it. He was going to keep his commitment.
But yeah, I thought he really came across fantastic on this thing, and really goes to show that obviously the core talent of the Beatles is the Beatles, but you need those supporting people around you, like a Mal Evans, like a Glenn Johns,
yes,
to really make sure everything can go smoothly and we get a finished product.
Exactly, and so Glenn's going to come up in just a minute, but let's talk about the great Billy Preston and how all that came about. It's fantastic.
Loved Billy, man. He comes into Apple Studios just kind of going to hang out, talk to the lads. They've known each other back to their Hamburg days,
yes,
which I thought was great. I mean, Billy even helped Nat King Cole back when he was like a teenager. So back in the early days, he started before even the Beatles did.
Yeah, and he was and he was the way they knew he was helping him was backing for Little Richard.
That's right.
So at that point, Billy had probably back in those days, a greater standing than the Beatles did. Yeah, he's just dropping by. He's in town for a TV appearance. So he's just dropping by to say hi.
Mm-hmm. And then as they go, they're like, you know what, man? We actually have some keyboard parts here that we need some help with. Would you mind stepping in and, doing some takes with us?
Billy was a man, at least on film, of very few words.
Oh, yeah.
And he's just sitting there smoking. He's always got a cigarette, as all these guys do. But he's just sitting there smoking, and he just smiles like, yeah. Like he didn't realize at first that it's like, yeah, dude, you're just going to go ahead and play on this.
Yeah, and as it goes longer, then they even discuss, like, oh, yeah, we got to make sure that Billy gets paid and whatnot. And there's a point where in the doc where George jokingly is saying, hey, man, we should have Billy join the group. And then later on, he goes, hey, maybe we can have Dylan join the group. And Paul, he kind of knows it's a joke, but he shot that down real quick.
Yeah, Paul's like, nah.
It's like, with four of us, it's tough enough to get anything done. But, yeah, man, and Billy really adds a great texture and sound to all the tracks that he appears on, man.
And it energized him after
that. Yeah.
Just having, us four look at each other for, at this point, 7-8 years, and now, we got this new force in here.
Which had never been done. He's still, he's the only person who was ever credited on a Beatles record.
Yeah, exactly. Because Clapton didn't get his credit on his.
That's right.
So, yeah, I just thought he was great. I thought he added so much to it. Now we're going to shift a little bit to where you can see the fracturing starting. And that's Alan Klein.
Yeah, I didn't know that John Lennon was so high on Alan Klein.
Man,
he talks about, I'm going to meet him. I think he even talks about that when they were still at Twickenham. He ends up pushing it back. He finally meets with Alan Klein, who was, one of the biggest managers in music history.
Yeah, Rolling Stones. Ask them how they feel about him stealing part of their early
Sam Cooke
musical catalog. But yeah, and he even mentions, I stay with him until 2:30 in the morning. He's telling George or Ringo that, he knows me just as well as you guys do?
No, I found that very interesting.
I mean, he was taken by this guy.
And then he ends up bringing that up to Glenn Johns, and Glenn kind of pushes back saying, yeah, he's a strange guy. And then John's like, oh, well, he's always been good with me. And then Glenn rightly says, well, he's probably like that because you're John Lennon.
I love that. Yeah, but with me, if I'm telling him, say he asks me a question, I tell him something in the middle of it, he doesn't like what I'm telling him, he just changes the subject. So, yeah, I thought that just difference. And obviously, if you know Beatles history later on, Alan Klein is one of the main reasons the final breakup happens, because Paul's having none of it. And Paul was right. But they were just taken in. They were just taken in.
Yeah, and they even meet with him as a group at one point at Apple Studio. We don't get to see that, of course, but
no.
But yeah, just an interesting little tidbit thrown in here as well. So on a different note, though, I thought it was cool to see just the harmony at different points at Apple Studios as well.
I think just all the jamming in general.
Yeah.
These guys were constantly. Even back at Twickenham, they're just constantly jamming to whatever. Not even their own songs all the time. Classic songs, traditional songs.
Some Eddie Cochran in there. Yeah,
they're just jamming constantly. One of them will just start messing around and jamming, and the other ones will jump in. But yeah, then the harmonizing between John and Paul. listen, these guys already had several problems, and you don't see it so much here. But, you're working with somebody this closely all the time. I mean, I would give us another 3-4 years in this channel. We're going to be each other's throats about what we should do creatively. But but musically, when they get on those instruments and on those mics, I found one of the parts towards the end of part 2 on Two of Us, which is one of my favorite songs of theirs, and that has not changed after seeing it on here. But they start messing around in these weird voices, which they did a lot. John did it a lot, but Paul did a lot. Paul could sing in these just crazy voices, which we see on Kansas City and some other songs in their catalog. But he's singing in this bizarro voice, and John just comes right on in the same bizarro voice, and they're harmonizing together in this bizarro voice. And this happens several times. It's just so amazing to see two people that in sync musically.
Yeah, no matter what they're doing, what they're trying to pull off. I think that's a great point, Dad. And it was still cool to see that there was that lighthearted nature. Whereas, in the original Let It Be film, I think it was more, this was all just so doom and gloom. Yeah. Whereas here, we kind of get a more full picture, I guess you could say. And another one of my favorite things was seeing George help my guy Ringo do Octopus Garden in episode 3. There's a point in here as well. We talked about Yoko being in the studio. Well, Paul brought in the lovely Heather McCartney, as
Linda's around,
and Linda's in there taking pictures at different points. Ringo and Heather McCartney had a really funny moment on the drum kit. Even in this talking about the jamming, there's a point where Paul's playing Strawberry Fields on the piano, and there was a point where they did a different version of Help. So it was just really cool to kind of see the camaraderie point in this documentary, as well, man.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a point where the four recognized, kind of how they needed something to aim at and have an end point, and then having relief knowing that they had enough songs, because they're like, and throughout the doc, Michael keeps coming in, what are we doing here? And we're not going to do, we're going to do this movie, we're going to do this TV special. Well, it was TV special, then it was movie. Then it's like, maybe we won't do anything.
And then it's like, well, maybe we can do it outside at a park for a live performance. Then that falls through. And so they're recognizing, hey, man, we kind of need an aim to this. Like, why are we doing this? What is this? What is the purpose of all that? And that kind of struck me, too, how I guess disorganized a lot of this was.
It was, but it also struck me there because you saw some vulnerability in Paul. And if you know your Beatles history, Paul's the one who was crushed by this break.
Yeah.
Paul's the one that didn't want it to happen. The other three were ready. Ringo might have been ambivalent, who knows. George and John were ready, but Paul was trying to keep this thing together. And I think Paul was feeling, I think you could almost feel in him that pressure of going, or just sadness of like, I know this might be the last time we ever record together. Now, it wasn't, but, we'll get into that in a minute on Abbey Road. But, you could feel it in him, almost that desperateness and just sadness in that scene. It was just came right through the screen.
Yeah, and then there was almost some relief as they started like looking, okay, we actually do have like 12, 13 songs because, they just kept doing so many takes of Don't Let Me Down and Get Back and Two of Us.
Joe was in my head for like, I'd seriously wake up in the middle of the night, Joe.
And then there was like, that relief, Dad, where it's like, okay, we do this. And then, of course, they were like, all right, let's head to the rooftop. But there's another point in here, too, towards the end of the doc where, as we're up to number 23 here, George talking about how he wanted to branch out on his own.
Because we had heard All Things Must Pass. He'd done that. He did Old Brown Shoe, and I think that's when he started talking about this. He was talking to Yoko and John.
Yeah, he was all like, maybe do my own thing, do my own record. But I found it interesting, too, that he was still thinking he'd be part of the Beatles as well, just kind of have his solo thing and be part of the group.
Yeah, John kind of reiterated, do your own thing, but still be part of the group. He's like,
And so, and I think I kind of forgot about that till you just brought it up. When they performed All Things Must Pass together at Twickenham, I thought that was a great version of that. And,
it was, man.
It could have fit really well on the Let It Be record. But
it could have.
That was an interesting tidbit. We got a couple more things. Number 24, we just kind of combined them together. Paul and John, man, just so awesome to see two musical giants come together and, no pun intended, and just see their creative process.
It was absolutely surreal. It was just absolutely surreal to see them still on the same page, go at each other a little bit, almost in a, like we know we're serious, but we're not yelling and screaming at each other, and we have a little jokiness to it, but just how they were just bonded, man. How they were bonded was so freaking cool, man. I just, and I think John's obviously not doing much here creatively.
No, Not as much as, I think, too, that harkens back. John, it was his band. He was the leader for a large portion of their early career. Sgt. Pepper is probably where it flips to where it's, kind of Paul being the de facto
They even
leader.
have a discussion about that was kind of surreal about the leadership of the group. But, yeah, I thought John came off as... It's just weird to see John, right? John's been gone for 40 years. And I was 9 years old, 10 years old. I just turned 10 when he was killed. So I didn't know anything about John. I didn't know why everybody was so upset. So just to see him was just surreal. Now, I could see how he'd get on your nerves after a little while if you were serious and he's just always joking. But that was John's way of coping through everything he'd been through in his life. But he just came off so... The guy's charisma, even in the point where he's just...
Charismatic. That was a great word.
Insane, man. It's just insane. He's just so... likable. You want to give him a hug because you can tell he's in pain still.
No, you're right, man.
And then we talked about a little bit with Paul, but I mean that guy, whether you like him, whether you hate him, we've been accused on here both of us being we love John, so we must hate Paul. Paul's a freaking genius. He's a musical genius.
That really came through in this whole thing.
And I'll tell you what else came through to me when I was watching it. The other three knew it.
Oh, yes.
You almost felt like they were intimidated a little bit by his musical prowess. Not just by him being domineering. That's how it was always framed.
Yeah,
I think they would have been intimidated like, this guy
there was a moment in Twickenham where it was just Ringo and Paul's at the piano, and they're playing together, and then he tells Ringo to get on and play some type of chord.
That's right, that was cool.
Ringo's just kind of blown away by it all, and I think that's a fantastic point you bring up there, Dad, that they all knew that they were in the presence of a kind of once-in-a-generation type of talent.
I mean, let's be honest too. Like he could play the guitar better than George could. Everyone said that. He could play the drums better than Ringo.
No, we see him playing piano.
It's insane.
He was playing drums in that kind of jam session at the end of episode 1. Obviously, the guitar, like you said. Obviously, the bass. Obviously, singing and all these different types of voices. It's just it was a spectacle to behold.
It was, and I'm not a huge fan of Paul's, and I've been outspoken his solo stuff. We got to see him in concert 2.5 years ago. One of the highlights of my life. It's not hyperbole. Like, it's insane, man. It was insane.
Glorious, man.
But, I think sometimes he's such a genius and too smart and too cute for his own good. I don't like some of that stuff in the solo career, but this shows you he needed somebody just to tell him no every once in a while. But he's a force, man.
Yeah,
he is a force in the absolute greatest way. You have anything else to add on these two?
Dude, I don't. I think, like you said, Dad, it's so long ago, over 50 years that this happened, and yet still you couldn't help but keep your eyes on the screen, seeing just these guys talk. And,
and John came out later on. In the Playboy interview he did before he died, he's really has some spewing some stuff against Paul, but. He said, after I listened to Get Back for a while, I thought, it's probably about me. But you go back and watch this, it's not about him.
No.
and then John said, but sometimes maybe I just read stuff into things after a while, but it wasn't about him. So you go back and see this and go, no, there wasn't all. Later on, there's all this going back and forth and whatever, man. But even towards the end here, it was just greatness. And I guess I'll mention, they started recording Abbey Road very shortly after this.
Yeah.
And that's why Abbey Road is a fantastic album. And it was always weird, they were about ready to kill each other during Get Back, but now they're able to come together in Abbey Road. No.
Then you see,
it was just a continuation of they were fine. And now we get to the culminating point, Trey. 25.
Number 25, of course, the whole Rooftop performance, man. I thought that it was a wonderful editing because there was, I think, about 10 different cameras.
Oh, it's crazy. I couldn't follow it all. I wanted to watch every one of them in the screen.
That Michael Lindsey-Hogg initially set up. There was one across the street, of course, multiple on the rooftop. There was a hidden camera in Apple Studios at the front, which gave us a kind of fly-in-the-wall view of whenever the cops come in.
Or the bobbies for our UK fans. They were so put out.
Oh, and he was so young and intimidated, I think, too. He was all like, you're going to need to turn this down. And, it was really cool seeing the OG reactors on the street wherever they were like, hey, you know who this is?
A lot of people said they didn't like that. That could have been cut. I thought that was great. I wanted to see who. And the way that it was great because Debbie, the secretary, is kind of in the doorman, just kind of playing dumb. And then Mal comes down.
They're very cheeky, just kind of with a smirk like, I think they're up there.
I think they're up there. And Mal comes down and Mal's like, oh, you can hear him? Oh, I didn't know you could hear him. You know what? I'll go up and tell him to turn it down. So he goes up, he comes back, and he's like, oh, you can still hear him? Well, there's something I can work on in the studio. I'll be right back. And they're just stalling so the Beatles can get through stuff. And, Michael Lindsey-Hogg said he cut out the multiple takes on the rooftop because he thought it was redundant. But I'm glad it was all on there.
Oh, yeah.
But I see why he did it because he's trying to cut it down to a 2.5 hour movie. But I'm glad that Peter just left it all.
Yeah,
in.
this was, I believe, the first time we got to see every part of the rooftop performance, man, and glorious 4K too.
The video quality of this whole thing is insane.
And just the whole it's disturbing the piece. It's like, man, this is the Beatles, and obviously it's the last time that they ever perform live, so that gives it an extra almost cherry on top to how iconic this is, and it's really awesome that we have it in all recorded and whatnot, and then they go up, Dad, and end up turning off the bass, shutting it down. George the Rebel turns his bass back on after Mal Evans kind of turned it off and whatnot for kind of one last hurrah, so to speak.
And it was funny too. The guy the camera that was on a different building. I guess they didn't ask him if they could do it.
That's right. He comes up. He's all like,
"That's my building," and they're just kind of talking around in circles. One of the stories is not in the doc. The concert starts at 1:00. It's 43 degrees outside. The wind's blowing. At about 12:30, it's about a half hour before, they're in a room underneath the roof, and they start talking to George like, "I don't want to play. It's 43. It's freezing cold. I'm not going to be able to feel my fingers. John won't be able to feel them, and so I don't want to play." And then Ringo's like, "Well, I want to play," and Paul's like, "I want to play." So it came down to John. And
the deciding vote.
Because if it was 2-2, they weren't going to play. They decided. So John looks around and finally he says, "F it. F it. Let's do it." So they go up and play. So it was
so glad that he did.
It was that close to never happening, man. So just crazy.
That would have been something else. But I think that was just the perfect capstone, and then they come back in one last day to kind of do some.
Yeah, I like that they still showed some stuff afterwards, and so as we sum this thing up, man, to me it wasn't too long, but I understand how people might think it was. And it was just absolutely surreal to watch. It was just insane to watch. You and I only really discovered the Beatles less than 3. We're almost at the 3-year anniversary of our channel. It's probably a couple months after. I knew some of their songs. I never listened to one of their albums because why would I? And just being able to dive into them like we have. We've spent literally 1,000 hours or more on the Beatles, and to be able to actually see them, because I didn't live through it. You definitely didn't live through it.
Yeah.
And just see it like I'm hanging out with them was just incredible, man. It was just absolutely incredible.
Well, I think that it just kind of highlights, just to kind of wrap this up, how charismatic and how just what a phenomenon they still are to this day with all types of ages,
and I think this
all
is
types
of
cultures.
This is just going to jump it up more, don't you think?
Yeah, and I mean, we had the anthology was mid-90s, so I think that was kind of a big deal. And then the one album came out in the 2000s, and then all their stuff went on Spotify, this or that. Now we got this. Like, there's just stuff that continues to kind of remind the cultural consciousness, if you will, about the lads, and it seems to kind of grip people all over again, like it did back in 60, 62, 63.
They're really the only cultural phenomenon that I can think of. TVs, movies, anything.
Yeah. No,
Any
you're
other
right,
music
man.
that somehow just stays relevant, sounds fresh, all these years later. It is absolutely insane. That's about all I got. I mean, if you haven't watched it, I definitely recommend you watch it. I mean, a lot of people having issues with certain part. Peter Jackson maybe had revisionist stuff. Whatever, man. I think it was done so well. And I will watch this whole thing again, man. I will revisit it from time to time, like revisiting some old friends. But this is going to be, not only is this a YouTube video for our normal viewers on Reaction to the Clouds, this is episode 1 of the podcast, and it's going to kick off season 2, where we're going to do sometimes me solo, sometimes Trey is going to join me. We're going to talk about the different Beatles who could have been called the fifth Beatle. George Martin really was, but all the other parts and different parts of the stories of the Beatles. And we'll throw a couple little standalones on different things. But it's going to be a very Beatles-centric season. Some of those episodes are going to be up on YouTube. We're going to film them just like this. And some are only going to be on the podcast. The link is a little ways down below in your description. Come subscribe to the Reactions to the Classics podcast. Leave a review if you would. And man, that's what's coming. And it's all going to come at you pretty rapid fire.
No, but definitely looking forward to that, Dad. And man, just great to sit back, talk in a little more long form discussion on this. And I mean, there's so much more we could have touched on too.
Is.
So let us know as well your favorite parts of the Get Back documentary. And man, we'll and if you haven't checked out our Let It Be song rankings or album review, you can go check that out as well. But I guess, Dad, that'll wrap it up.
That's it, man.
From us today, man. So until next time, y'all, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And we will see you.